And so welcome again to today's webinar. So most people have logged in, so let's start. My name is Jan Bervar. I work at Conscia as a group security architect. So the topic of today's webinar is your cyber defense strategy a waste of money? And for those of you who are not willing to wait until the end of the presentation, I can provide an answer right away. So typically, I would say yes. But as this year, we have a 42nd anniversary of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. For those of you who are fans, it makes sense to soften this answer into mostly yes. So we will discuss for the first half of the presentation why I think that most investments today, which are done in cybersecurity, are not perhaps a waste of money, but very inefficient. And then we will propose a solution, which is something which the mainstream should look like today, in my particular opinion. So if we're looking at cybersecurity investment and strategies, why are they mostly a waste of money? And to answer this question, we'll have to go a little bit back into the history and basically discuss the factors which have brought our state of security to what it is today. So when we look at the mainstream, or let's say the average organization which is deploying some kind of cybersecurity countermeasures or controls, we have the following, I think, main issues, which I typically call the black boxes of digital prevention. What happens today mostly is that in most of the areas in which we invest, for example, in governance, risk, and compliance, which deals with having a CISO, having policies, having the governance over your security organization, typically the problem is that theoretically it is there, but it rarely practically propagates beyond the office. So the policies are typically weakly implemented, are partly implemented, and the actual risk assessment and risk management does not go down to the operational level of most organizations. Secondly, if you're buying security technology, most people still buy technology up to the due diligence level. So they will buy things which are typically mainstream, like firewalls, anti-malware, they will patch systems and so on. But any kind of advanced security technology which gets typically implemented in a very inefficient manner. So it means that it is, let's say, it is 25 to 50% effective compared to what it could be. Yeah. And if you look at the actual process of security, which is built into our business processes, you can probably all agree that while we are actually having pretty good controls at the level of workers, as we go up the management ladder to managers, middle management, the C-level executives, we tend to relax any kind of business process security countermeasures and say basically those people up there need the controls relaxed in order to do important work. And it is no wonder that, for example, when phishing happens, it typically targets people who basically have relaxed controls applied to them. And even if we're actually doing security awareness training, for example, if we're training our users, for example, we have good numbers to actually prove that things are working. So we can typically bring phishing success levels from 70% to 5%. But this 5%, for example, along with all the other percentages, basically should tell us that prevention is basically about probability. Anti-malware typically prevents a certain percentage, let's say 50 or 60% of all malware. Patching, most people, for example, have at least 90% of systems today which have at least one known vulnerability. Yeah. If advanced security technology is implemented 25%, it means it will have 70% gap in prevention capability. And if we're not enforcing policies at the top of our organizational ladder, then obviously there's a certain percentage of people who basically to whom security controls don't apply. So when we talk prevention, our big problem is prevention is not perfect. It's never 100%. It is basically percentage based. So there's always a certain amount of threats which are not covered by the prevention we have deployed today. And the second problem is it's a black box. So on the right-hand side, I think that we have a photo of let's say an average CISO today who is praying that his prevention works because we have deployed prevention and we hope things will work, and we are only typically notified by an incident to see that we were wrong. So moving on from this mainstream approach, there are two extreme solutions to this, or people actually react in two extreme ways. One is what I call preventive utopia on the left-hand side, and one is called the ignorance is bliss approach. So in preventive utopia, basically what you want to say is basically let's bring prevention to the highest possible level. So let's invest in additional prevention technologies and let's configure them in a way that they actually approach 100% efficiency. So basically, we buy more prevention technology, or in the modern times, we buy more subscriptions, which is what the vendor actually wants from you. Then you want to actually look at the whitelisting approach to basically allow the minimum allowed activity in your environment. So you lock yourself down and often out of your system with whitelisting. And you suspend your external data exchange, and of course you fire all of your employees. Again, this is a bit funny because this is a utopia of prevention. So basically having all possible prevention technology deployed, having it configured to 100% efficiency, which typically means like a whitelisting approach. And this, of course, is not possible today because the complexity of IT that we have prevents us from really effectively implementing whitelisting because we're simply not aware about what should be allowed in our systems. Suspending the external data exchange, of course, should not be suspended, but heavily controlled. And all our employees typically will not be fired, but somehow also educated. So preventive utopia, again, is a utopia. On the other hand, ignorance is bliss is a much more comfortable scenario because it says basically, I'm not an interesting target. I don't have to do any of that. The problem today and in the past has been that there's always automated attackers. And today we have seen automation brought to really, really interesting levels with ransomware. So automation on the attacker side basically says, I will create malware which is trying to infect everybody. So you cast your web so wide that you're basically reaping the fruits of basically mass infection. And even if you're not an interesting target, either politically or financially, ransomware will find you automatically. Just look at what happened to some automakers and some organizations which had locked down networks or industrial networks. Ransomware found a way automatically into those networks. And basically, it brings down the fact that everybody is an interesting target to ransomware or to any kind of automated attacker. The second approach in the ignorance is bliss is, well, even if I'm an interesting target, nothing major has happened to me so far. People have certain risk biases, and if something does not happen to you, you automatically think it is less probable. And if we had this kind of mentality with car insurance, things would be very interesting. And lastly, in the ignorance is bliss sector, people say if something were to happen to me, it would be very small. It would be minor. And the data from the field actually shows the opposite. Now, you have probably seen this kind of graph. I will enlarge it. So this is the graph from the Ponemon report, which basically says what is the loss per incident based on company size. And those are millions of dollars. By the way, the average in the world incident cost this year was more than 3 million euros. And this shows you how this is distributed along companies of different sizes. So even if you're from a small company, which is like less than 500 employees, you will typically see more than 2.5 million of business loss per incident, per a single incident where sensitive data is involved. And you see that this doesn't grow like exponentially or heavily linearly. It slowly grows as the company size will grow. So those two approaches, so preventive utopia and ignorance is bliss, are obviously both invalid in today's world. So what is a good approach? So years ago, I think one of the wisest words in cybersecurity history was spoken when some people actually went to an assume breach model of security. Assume breach basically says, if I'm doing any kind of security architecture, design, implementation, I want to assume that my controls are not working. And I will assume I will get breached. And this allows you to tackle some of the most difficult problems in security. Assume breach basically says, for example, like the Titanic, that you have to build systems which basically are resilient to single points of failure. And Titanic was actually built for this, although the implementation was pretty bad. So perimeter security was from before we actually said assume breach. In perimeter security, if you remember internet security of the 90s, we simply said, in order to protect my systems, I will bring a hard shell around it, and hopefully this will prevent any attackers from reaching the soft, chewy core, the sweet core of my IT system. And in 2003, people said, well, this doesn't work, because people found out that attackers will always find a way to penetrate your first line of defense. And one of the problems of today's architectures is that sometimes your first line of defense is not at the outer boundary of your system. It's not at the perimeter, it's actually inside. For example, consider if your network edge is not, for example, preventing any kind of exploits, like client exploits, from reaching your internal systems, then the patching of your internal systems, or HIPS or similar technology, is your first line of defense. And if that fails, the attacker is already on your inside client. So perimeter security is not always the perfect place to actually place your defenses, and sometimes you have to move your first lines deeper inside your network. Yeah? And of course, if your first line of defense is your only line of defense, then a single attack will actually penetrate your system to the degree that it causes significant damage. And remember one, I think, extremely important security rule or assumption: the odds or the probabilities are always on the side of the attacker. The attacker has to find one way of penetrating us, while we actually have to defend against every possible way which applies in our environment. So assume breach, while it's a valid proposition or valid kind of theory, it actually brings together, I think, some kind of dark thinking that we are doomed, because obviously it's a very, very hard task in front of us if we want to assume breach. Assume breach also has a second thing, which I think is very important for security designers, which is that if you actually assume that your system will be breached, and you can list those ways, you can actually then somehow see the future, what will happen after my system has been initially breached. And with this, you can tackle one of the biggest problems of security, which is called transitive trust. Transitive trust meaning if A trusts B and B trusts C, then A will trust C, which, for example, means if one client is surfing the internet and this client is also talking to a very sensitive backend system internally, then internet and the backend systems are in contact over this proxy client. And if we actually assume breach of the client, then we can actually start modeling some really good prevention and detection techniques. So assume breach, I think, is the most important way we have actually developed in the first decade of the 2000s. So how do we actually now create architectures based on this? So we have created, I think, in the past, two different ways to look at the assume breach theory and to actually say, what if my prevention is not working? What should I do? And those two big architectures typically are called defense in depth and detection and response. So let's today look a little bit about how they actually work, because this is security architecture. So defense in depth on the left-hand side basically says, I want to have multiple preventive layers of defense, which means I want to create my security controls so that if one control fails, there will be another one backing it up. Now, I typically call it the belt and suspenders approach, or a kind of security redundancy if you want. So what would be an example of defense in depth? An example of defense in depth would be to have, for example, two different firewalls from different vendors at the edge of your network. If one has a bug, hopefully the other one doesn't. The problem is that people often misunderstand what defense in depth means. For example, a lot of people think that if you have a firewall and an anti-malware program on your desktop, that's defense in depth. No, that is defense in breadth. You're covering different threats. If the firewall fails, your anti-malware will not prevent exploitation. And if your anti-malware fails, your firewall cannot prevent malware from coming in. So there are different controls looking at different risks. So defense in depth basically means if we are doing prevention and want higher assurance, we need to have multiple layers of the same kind of technology or the same kind of approach. The problem is that defense in depth is extremely hard to implement, those layers of security. Another example, for example, would be that you have firewalls externally on the perimeter and internal segmentation in the data center. Now, that's an example of defense in depth. But how many people are actually doing this successfully? Well, if you look at the statistic, which is, I think, a very telling one, the 200 days of dwell time, it typically tells us that it's not working well in practice. What is dwell time? Dwell time is the time which we need from the time that attacker enters our system to the time we actually detect them. And the average in the world currently is 200 days. So this is the time needed for us to detect an attacker who has penetrated our first lines of defense. 200 days. This is more than 6 months. So defense in depth is about having multiple layers of prevention in our IT system. On the other hand, detection and response is basically saying prevention is nice, but can we actually also have the capability to not prevent, but detect, contain, and eradicate threats? So this is the yang to the yin of prevention, like they are the yang and yin, or two sides of the same coin. So detection and response, the promise of detection and response would be that those 200 days, if we have good detection and response, would be shrunk to hours or days. So instead of having 200 days of the attacker in our system, we would actually be able to identify this activity in perhaps 1 hour, 2 hours, or a couple of days at maximum. Yeah? And this detection and response approach is actually one form of defense in depth. So most people think about defense in depth that you have to have multiple preventive layers of defense, which means like a perimeter firewall and a data center firewall. While you can actually have layers which are preventive and detective. So you can have prevention done properly, and then you can back it up using detection and response. So those two things work as belts and suspenders. So don't think you need to have multiple prevention layers. It can always be, or you can a lot of times actually choose detection and response to be the second layer, which gives you the assurance of actual prevention and containment. And I think it's important, I think this is a very philosophically important consequence. Detection and response is typically much more efficient in in detecting a wide range of threats. Yeah, prevention is very specific. Prevention basically says, I want to control network traffic. I want to control data. I want to control access to a certain system. Yeah? While detection and response is a much more broad philosophy of protection. Basically, it says, I want to look for anomalies. I want to look for things which are suspicious. And because it's so broad, it is typically like an umbrella which will catch any kind of attacks which have been missed by preventive controls. So while prevention is razor sharp, it can address specific things. Detection is very broad, like an umbrella, and can catch anything your prevention is missing or where you have not been able to deploy prevention at all. So the left-hand approach, classic defense in depth with multiple prevention layers, is hard. The right-hand approach looks good, but so it's really it's able to shrink down the dwell time to days. It provides defense in depth, and it's an umbrella which catches everything we are missing. So the question is, why is not everybody deploying detection and response? So the question is, does it smell? Does it stink? Yeah? And when you say to people, well, why don't you deploy it? And people say, well, we'll do it someday. Yeah? So why this kind of bad rap around detection and response? Well, the answer is, it's invisible to management. Detection and response basically does not prevent any kind of activity and is therefore invisible to users. So it's hard sometimes to actually say you need it or you want to invest money in it if it doesn't have obvious immediate results. Secondly, it doesn't involve any magic technology. There's no magic products. Like in prevention, every year we have a new magic product which says it will prevent all malware. Of course, it turns out it doesn't, but detection and response does not rely on magic technology. It relies on people. And it is one of the hard truths of information security that prevention is effort light and detection is effort heavy. So in order to do prevention, typically you have to configure something and then more or less leave it alone. While with detection, you have to invest a lot in actual human resources to provide this capability. Of course, there are tools involved, but 90% of work is humans. And lastly, the humans are typically supermen. So if you want to have detection and response capability in your system, typically you require between 2 and 15 supermen. By supermen, I mean people who are highly, highly capable in all the areas of IT to provide this functionality. And first of all, where will you find them today? And second of all, how much will they cost? So those are the problems of detection and response. Yeah, it is an excellent approach to security, but how can we actually deploy this in our environments considering all those issues? So to actually make a better case for detection and response, I would like to present you a better way of investing in security technology and security processes. So in traditional approach, on the left-hand side, I have a graph. On the graph, I have On the bottom, you see risk coverage, which means as I'm deploying new stuff, how much of the risks am I covering? Am I addressing with this coverage? And on the left-hand side, I have this for different levels of maturity of an organization. So let's say you are at a low level of maturity, you are starting out with security, and you deploy certain prevention mechanisms, which will cover, let's say, 1/3 of your risk. So you have identified certain risks you have, and prevention so far has been able to cover 1/3. And as you are progressing through the years, you're basically getting better. You're deploying more, you invest in more prevention, and you arrive at a certain level where you basically say, based on the complexity of our environment, I cannot do more prevention. I cannot lock down things more without breaking stuff. And the more you invest, the less you get from prevention, because you're making smaller and smaller improvements in time. So at a certain time, you say, well, now I want to actually do the big step, and I want to invest in detection. And detection covers a huge chunk of your risk space. And you can then become more mature and you're approaching the 100% risk coverage, which is the holy grail of security. So this is the traditional approach of basically building your defenses, starting small, basically building prevention up to the point where you're not able to do so, and then looking at detection and response. At Conscia, we propose a different approach, which we feel is much better. We feel that it's much better to basically build things in a smart way. So of course, you will have to start with building basic prevention mechanisms first, because they are easy to deploy and they're very effective against a certain range of threats. But what we propose is that you start with detection and response early in your maturity. This will basically, of course, provide a much larger chunk of risk coverage early on in your maturity, and basically bring significant lower risk to your business. And then based on this, you can then grow with prevention and grow with detection and response through the years. So obviously, this approach actually provides much more extensive risk coverage at a much earlier maturity level in time. So you don't have to wait until you realize that you cannot do any more prevention, but you can actually start doing the huge leap of risk coverage much earlier. But how do we do this? Because we need Superman, remember? We need a lot of human effort and so on. And as another perhaps argument why this is good is how costly is detection and response in the long term. And Ponemon Institute also made a research about if you have an incident, and looking back, what was the most cost-effective control which was deployed by your organization? It was the question in the survey, and this was the results. So these are the factors which are impacting the cost of a data breach. And you see on the top are things which are the most cost-effective controls. In the first three, you have basically 2 out of 3 which are detection-based. So formation of an incident response team and tests of the incident response plan. So detection and response are proven in the field to be the most cost-efficient methods of doing this. But again, how to deploy this? If you want to do this yourself, you need the people, you need the budget, and this is truly very, very expensive. So the purpose of today's presentation is to present one solution. So at Conscia, we basically provide a managed detection and response service. So this is the idea of basically getting this at approximately 1/3 of the price you would pay yourself, 1/3 of the cost, by using a managed service for detection and response. By having a managed service, you can typically modularly decide what you need from an external partner to provide those services. And Conscia SOC, the Security Operations Center, which we run out of Slovenia, is basically a way to provide those services. There are 4 pillars to the service which we offer. So there are 4 distinguishing characteristics. We basically have a very expert team, a platform to provide detection and response to customers. We have a very flexible way of choosing what data will be used in your environment to look at suspicious activity. This can be either your own sensors, your own detection technology, or we can bring technology on board. What is, I think, very important is that our SOC is not a after-the-fact thing, but is also something which actually looks at your incidents before they happen, as they happen, and prevents them in the long term. And we are local. We provide local incident response and local engineering support for cleaning up after incidents. So those would be the 4 pillars of what we feel is a very good managed detection and response service, which will allow you to have the detection and response capability quickly, and at a much lower cost compared to what you would do in-house. Now, looking at SOC as a service, what are basically components of this solution? So there are a bunch of SOC as a service solutions in the marketplace, and our solution is highly modular. So what do I mean by modular? Basically, it says that we have a security operations module as the core element of the subscription. Security operations basically means we will set up the sensors in your IT system, we will monitor them, we will detect suspicious activity, we will investigate suspicious activity, and we will tune the camera system, if I call this the camera system. And of course, we will provide the indications to you if something is going on, and monthly reports indicating the trends. This is the core element of a managed detection and response service, which is basically the detection part and analysis part. Then optionally, the customers can opt for incident response module. Based on detected incidents in the green module, we can provide you with a plan to contain it, or actually work with you remotely or on-site to actually stop the incident and repair your systems. We have modules which are optional again, which allow you to detect things before they would become incidents. We use threat hunting, so basically looking for threats which have not yet materialized, vulnerability assessments, and honeypots to basically detect things before they actually cause any damage. And what I think is really important, we use lifecycle consulting to basically, based on the feedback of the first three modules, provide you with a roadmap and strategy for further development of your prevention or detection in the future. So this is the idea of the service. So from those modules which you see on top, you pick and choose what you need, typically the green module plus perhaps one of the additional modules, and combine this with an SLA, which basically says at what times we are doing this, 8x5, 24/7, and how quickly do you want us to respond. And typically it's 60 minutes after we have detected the first traces, we will actually provide you with the first expert verdict or start of incident response. So this is the packaging of the service, of the managed detection and response service. And by using this service, I think you get three basic benefits. One of the obvious one is by shrinking the 200 days of average dwell time into hours or days, you will get immediate prevention of business loss. We are addressing a huge amount of the risk space, which you are not covering at the moment, enabling you basically to say, if something slips your prevention, we will be able to catch it in hours or months, and together with you stop it. Then secondly, based on the feedback of this service, you will be able to have a clear investment strategy for the future to basically see what exactly is going wrong in your environment, what to invest in preventively and detectively. So basically it gives you a plan, a clear roadmap for the future to get from level 2 to level 3 in that maturity scale. And lastly, if you need detection and response for your compliance needs, this basically obviously provides it. Now, a managed detection and response platform basically has a lot of different technical aspects and a lot of different process aspects. By quickly going through this, let's just discuss how we are actually doing this. So at the bottom of our platform, what we have is the cameras. Now, the technology which is actually providing us with a view of suspicious activity. And contrary to many offerings in the market, we insist on having network and endpoint visibility. This is, I think, the minimum you need because, again, network-only visibility is typically blind for encrypted traffic and so on. And you absolutely need to have both the network and the endpoint providing with telemetry for suspicious activity detection. Secondly, we want to have a very transparent and deterministic way of detecting. And we base this on industry standard attack frameworks, as you will see. We have something which is way beyond CM, which is called SOAR. SOAR is Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response. We basically have automated systems which help our analysts be much faster when detecting incidents. We have response playbooks which are basically tailored to you, not to us. It's not like a low-cost carrier. We have to adapt to the carrier, but we actually we are like a business plane where we adapt our schedule and our way of working to your IT processes. And on the top, the costly part, which is transferred then to us, the SOC team, which is basically a team of trusted analysts, which is constantly educating. I think this is the way you should actually build a true MDR platform. Now, the way to look at the deterministic detection, if you know the MITRE framework, this is the framework of detection created by the corporation MITRE. I suggest you look at it. The idea is that they actually model the way the attackers behave and what attacks they're using, and they have been able to more or less completely model what is seen today in terms of attackers. So you can look at this framework at the above URL, and our SOC team uses this in something which we call a Conscia detection framework to basically make sure that we are detecting those things. So it's not like our SOC is saying we will detect everything and then not tell you what we are detecting. We actually work with you. We're using this kind of methodology to determine what can be and what will be detected in your environment with your sensors. Now, the way this is deployed in customer environments, there are two different deployment models, two different architectures. First one we call integration SOC, which basically says the SOC will connect to your CM system, which is typically an existing system, which connects to the event sources in your network. So if you're already running a CM system or you have a need to integrate a lot of different event sources and data sources, this is the perfect way to actually integrate this. Yeah? This kind of methodology basically says what you have is good, but we might want to enhance it if we feel together this is necessary. And basically what the CM is reporting, we will actually take, we tune it and connect it to our platform. And most of the data, like 99.9%, stays at the customer side. Only small correlations will actually go to our SOC and be further analyzed. So this model allows us to keep more or less all of the data at the customer side, while actually having the flexibility of being able to integrate any kind of event source supported by the customer CM. The second model which we use is what we call the all-in-one SOC. In this case, we don't rely on the customer to have a CM. This is typically for customers who are starting with detection and they don't have a CM. We actually provide the entire bundle of technology for detection. Actually, we provide all the cameras. So as part of the SOC subscription, you also get all the technology which gets deployed on your site, and this is typically endpoint detection response and network threat detection capability. So you get both critical capabilities, and if need, and this basically brings you SOC capability immediately. In a couple of weeks or within a month, you will have full visibility which is needed to start a SOC. And optionally, of course, the right-hand side solution can be extended with a CM to become the left-hand side solution. So the right-hand one is like a fast deployment one for those of you who don't have a CM yet, or you're not willing to invest in a CM and want to have immediate good visibility, while the left-hand one is the one for the organizations which have already invested heavily in CMs and have a well-tuned environment, or it can be well-tuned by our team. In both cases, the vast majority of data will always stay at the customer side. Just a minimum of data is analyzed by SOC and deleted after it's no longer used. So those are the two models which we use. The right-hand one, the all-in-one, for example, we also have a special flavor which can be used in industrial environments. So if you're running ICS, OT technology, for example, manufacturing, auto industry, we have specialized sensors as well for those OT networks. Okay, so this more or less concludes the presentation of how the problem of detection and response can be solved quite easily today. In terms of questions, there are typically some questions which are always asked about this service. Because this is a very short presentation, I would love to go on for hours, but I don't want to burden you with this. Let me just answer some frequently asked questions before going to your actual questions today. So in terms of frequently asked questions, typically, how do you consume this service? And typically, it's a fixed price monthly subscription. The only variable cost typically is associated with incident response. So if there's an incident and you want to have people, let's say, remotely or on-site helping you, that of course is built on a time and materials basis, but the detection service and all of the services which deal with detection are fixed price monthly subscriptions based on the size of your organization. Secondly, what kind of data sources can I include in the analysis of your SOC? Basically anything which is supported by your CM. If we can actually support it in your CM or write parsing rules for your CM, we can support it on the SOC team. The third classic question is, what about the CM platform? So if I have an existing CM platform, will you manage it? Yes, typically we manage it. We tune it as part of the service. We manage it fully. Of course, we can also co-manage it if you don't feel comfortable with full external management. So it can be managed by two parties, or we should be given adequate insight into basically looking at the data. So multiple models are possible. We can also, of course, provide the CM platform if you don't have one and require the integration model immediately. The fourth question is, the data, as I said, stays at customer premises, with minimal excerpts being sent to the SOC and deleted as soon as possible, and whatever is exported will stay in the EU. And the last question is, typically, what kind of certifications do you have? We are 27001 certified, 9001 certified, and all of our SOC guys are SANS GX certified, which is typically considered to be the most important certifications in this area. Okay, before we go to questions, I have spent like the vast majority, 2/3 of my presentation, showing that prevention historically has been really extremely a limited discipline. So it's razor sharp when it works, but first of all, it has limits, especially in complex environments. As the environment becomes complex, it's harder and harder to actually describe what are the allowed actions. Therefore, the whitelisting approaches, which are the most effective approaches in security, will typically start failing at a certain point. And we have seen that detection and response is great, especially because it provides you with a very big chunk of risk coverage. If you remember the stacked picture of different colors, we have seen that if you are building only prevention, you're slowly building up to your full capability. And if you are actually putting detection and response early in your security pipeline, you will very quickly get really extensive coverage of risks. We have also seen, in terms of investing, this is sensible, because by investing in this capability early, you basically get the best risk. And also, by the Ponemon report, this is the most cost-effective measure when it comes to reducing the cost of incidents. And the solution which I presented was managed detection and response. So having somebody else providing elements of detection and response to you. You can, of course, have this done with cooperation. So, for example, only outsource detection and do the response yourself. So that's why services should be modular. But if you're looking for this kind of solution, I always suggest two things. Make sure that coverage and flexibility are two things which are importantly covered. Coverage meaning that what the SOC is looking at, what kind of data. If it's network only, they will be half blind. It should be at least network at endpoint to start with. And the flexibility, the SOC should adapt to your business processes and your incident response processes, not the other way around. So now I will actually go to the Q&A section. Hopefully you have sent some questions to the Q&A panel. Henrik is waiting for your questions there. For your next steps, next questions, make sure you contact your Conscia account manager or directly to Henrik, whose email address you see here. And now I will go to your questions and answer them as they're coming in. So please use the Q&A panel to actually address questions to the panel, and we can address any kind of questions immediately. Okay, I already have the first question. The first question is, you were talking about 24/7 or 8x5 operations. So what does 8x5 mean? Does 8x5 mean that you are not looking at incidents during the night? No. The SOC is operating 24/7. If you have an 8x5 subscription, it only means that activity is analyzed during business hours, but it's detected also during the night. Which means, for example, if you have an 8x5 service and there is suspicious activity happening at 3 o'clock in the morning, it simply means it will start to be analyzed at 8 o'clock at 8 a.m. when the analyst morning shift begins. If you have a 24-hour subscription, it will start being analyzed immediately at 3 a.m. So it's 8x5 simply means that the analysis is during business hours, which means there will be typically a delay of a couple of hours before things are detected. Is this bad? Well, consider that the point of SOC is to bring the 200 days down to hours or days. So for some people, it is important. Some people would like to have something detected within the hour of the event. But for a lot of people, bringing 200 days down to half a day is more than acceptable. It's really something which typically prevents all of the business damage. Yeah, there's a question about OT. OT being operational technology. So if I have an industrial network, how do you make sure that your technology is not intrusive? Well, if you have an operational technology network, like a medical network or a manufacturing network with a lot of OT, not IT technology, what we do is we deploy passive sensors to basically learn about the normal behavior of the network, and then we actually investigate any kind of deviation from this normality. So we have specialized sensors for those networks. If I move a little bit back, so in my presentation, so when we were discussing different deployment models, so we said on the left-hand side you have a typical IT model with integration. On the right-hand side you have the all-in-one model where we actually bring the sensors as well. So the right-hand model can also be applied to OT networks, and this is where we actually bring the passive sensors as well if needed in the OT environment. If there are no additional questions, I will definitely invite you to contact your Conscia AM or send any kind of questions to Henrik, whose email address you can see in this slide. And at this point, I would like to thank everybody for joining the webinar, and make sure that you are tuned for additional webinars which are coming from Conscia in the security field, which are typically presented through Henrik and me, and I hope to see you in the future. Thank you very much.